It's an unusually clear day at the top of the 6th highest peak in New Hampshire. With February just settling in, the wind chills and freezing temperatures have hit record lows, and the biting cold is making the rugged climb up Mount Lafayette a challenge straight out of a survival movie. For adrenaline seekers, though, it's just another epic trek to the 1,600-meter summit. By 2 p.m., Milford hiker Marty Sample is descending a steep stretch of the mountain called the Old Brittle Path. He'd set out early, bumped into a few fellow hikers on his way up, and now with daylight slipping away, everyone's hustling back to camps before the cold and dark set in. However, before that would happen, something unusual caught Marty's eye. As he descended, he saw a lone figure making his way up the mountain. It was late for that. Too late. The man didn't blend in with the crowd of modern hikers Marty had seen all day. His thick, heavy beard framed a face weathered by time. His sinewy build carried a quiet resilience, and his height, barely 5'6", bent further by age or exhaustion, gave an unassuming presence. But there was something more about him. Despite the hunched posture and slow, deliberate steps, his movements spoke of experience. Marty could tell this man knew these mountains better than most. He clutched an old wooden alpenstick and a small, worn backpack. The kind of gear that didn't scream ambition, but rather familiarity. Perhaps he wasn't aiming for the summit, just heading toward one of the huts a little further up on the trail. Marty gave a polite hello as they passed. The man, without breaking stride, nodded back. Brief, almost dismissive. For a moment, Marty glanced over his shoulder, watching as he steadily disappeared up the trail. The encounter lingered in his mind. Not creepy, not alarming, just peculiar. But he didn't dwell on it for long. He kept moving, assuming that man knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't until days later that Marty learned the truth. That lone figure wasn't just any hiker. He was one of the most legendary climbers of the White Mountains, Guy Waterman. But that day, Guy wasn't just climbing a mountain. He was climbing his favorite mountain one last time, with no intention of ever coming back down. What's even more haunting is the weight Guy was carrying up that trail, a lifetime of unshakable pain, loss, and inner turmoil. After years of struggling, this was his way of trying to end the agony once and for all. But what he sought wasn't what he found. Even in death, peace didn't come. One has to wonder, on that fateful day, did Guy Waterman truly believe his climb would bring him the solace he so desperately wanted? There are people who think he didn't. This is his story. Forest and crag, wilderness ethics, backwood ethics, Yankee rock and ice, and a fine kind of madness. 5 books. One dynamic duo of writers and a shared passion driving every page. Classic mountain folklore served with a side of hard facts and a near-obsessive mission to keep modern gadgets and careless thrill seekers from ruining the untamed beauty of the mountains. That's how Guy Waterman spent the last 27 years of his life, off-grid on a 27-acre homestead with his partner, carving out a life far from the noise of the modern world. But while his final days were steeped in grief and heartbreak, the journey that led him there couldn't have been more different. It started out as a dream life, brimming with ambition, achievements, and the kind of moments most people only dare to imagine. Guy Van Vorst Waterman was born on May 1st, 1932 in New Haven, Connecticut, as the youngest of 5 kids. His dad, Alan Tower Waterman, was a Yale physics professor, and while Guy was still young, he landed a huge role as the first director of the National Science Foundation, which meant the family was constantly on the move, following Alan's career. Their first step was Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Guy discovered an interest for baseball that later turned into a lifelong passion. He'd eventually write for baseball magazines and even become a dedicated member of the Society for American Baseball Research. But before all that, in 1946, the family packed up and moved to Watertown, Connecticut, where Guy enrolled at Taft School and found his new passion, jazz piano. After yet another move, this time to Washington, D.C., Guy wrapped up his high school, and by the age of 16, he was already making a living playing with a ragtime band called Riverboat Trio. Apart from being a typical physicist, Guy's dad had two big interests outside of work: politics and the great outdoors. He was an old-school Roosevelt liberal and a seasoned outdoorsman. From a young age, Guy picked up on both of his dad's passions, but ended up embracing one and going in the complete opposite direction with the other. As a teenager, he became a stout Republican, but the two still spent many summers canoeing and hiking through the north woods of Maine and New Hampshire. Those trips brought out a side of him that stuck way more than his love for music or baseball ever did, though at the time, he didn't really see it. By the time he hit 18, the father-son friction came to a head again. Guy wanted to marry his high school sweetheart, Emily Morrison, and his dad wasn't on board. He told Guy he was too young to get married, but after some back and forth, he eventually gave in to his son's determination. They got married in 1950, and by the time Guy graduated from George Washington University in 1953, he and Emily already had 2 sons, with a third one on the way. It was around then that it hit him. He needed a steady job. Music, which had been his side hustle, wasn't going to cut it anymore. So with his economics degree, he landed a role as an economist at the Washington Chamber of Commerce from 1955 to 1958. But politics had a magnetic pull on him he couldn't ignore. Soon, Guy ended up working as a legislative aide for the Senate Minority Policy Committee and crafting speeches for big names like President Dwight Eisenhower, Vice President Richard Nixon, and Congressman Gerald Ford. For 2 years, he thrived in that whirlwind, but when Nixon lost the 1960 election, Guy packed up the family and moved to Stamford, where he took on a dual role at General Electric as a speechwriter and labor negotiator. On paper, life seemed great. Guy was climbing the financial ladder, earning respect and keeping his creative spark alive with his speechwriting gigs. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. While his coworkers were living it up in the corporate world, Guy would take long walks through Manhattan alone, sandwich in hand, sitting down at random spots to think. He couldn't help but feel out of place, like he just didn't fit into the buttoned-up life everyone else seemed so comfortable with. Leaning more into that side of himself, he joined the New York chapter of the Appalachian Mountain Club, or AMC, and in 1963 learned how to rock climb up in the Shawangunk Mountains. Just 3 years later, with the family dog tagging along, Guy and his 2 oldest sons, Bill and Johnny, managed to climb New Hampshire's 46th highest mountains in only 14 days, setting a new record. But while the pull of the mountains started pushing him to break free from the corporate grind, things at home were falling apart. What was once a passionate and romantic marriage had turned into something dull and strained. Maybe Guy was starting to see that his dad had a point. Getting married so young might have been a mistake. In 1969, he and Emily decided to call it quits and went their separate ways. For Guy, though, this was just the start of a whole new chapter. He started spending more time in the mountains, and that summer he crossed paths with a new member of the AMC who caught his attention like no one else had. She was a 30-year-old book editor named Laura Johnson, who, just like Guy, was chasing the mountains in her free time. Both Guy and Laura clicked instantly, and those wide-eyed trails and stunning views of the Shawangunk Mountain became the backdrop to their time together. They'd climb side by side, hike, camp, relax, and enjoy being outside, doing what they loved while loving it even more with each other. It wasn't long before they started dreaming of a life away from the hustle and bustle of society. In 1970, during a climbing trip to the White Mountains, a friend handed them a book called Living the Good Life, which gave them just the right push they needed. In the book, the writers Helen and Scott Nearing shared the story of their self-sufficient farm in Vermont, where they lived organically and free from the clutter of modern life. Guy and Laura knew right away they were doing this. In 1971, they bought a 27-acre homestead in Vermont and named it Barra, after the Waterman's family's ancestral homeland. The following year, they tied the knot and wasted no time moving into their new property. There they built a modest one-room cabin, complete with a disconnected toilet and Guy's beloved Steinway piano. Far from the chaos they wanted to escape, they found plenty of work to keep their calendar full all year long. The winter was all about ice climbing and trekking through the mountains. When spring rolled around, they'd tap a grove of sugar maple to make syrup. Living at Barra meant they had switched to a vegetarian lifestyle, so their vegetable garden kept them busy from late April to early June. After that, they had more time for climbing and hiking during the summer. But this was soon followed by canning, harvesting root vegetables, and weeks of chopping firewood for the winter. By Thanksgiving, they'd head out for more hiking. With no running water at Barra, they carried water up from a stream using a bucket and bathed in an old cattle trough. For nearly 2 decades, they lived on a budget of just $3,000 a year, until 1994 when Guy's Social Security made things a little easier. Before that, their only income came from freelance writing. But their tight budget wasn't even the toughest part of life at Barra. They had no phones, no electric lights, no computers, no radio, no motors. Basically nothing mechanical at all. Whatever they did, from the smallest of tasks to the toughest of chores, they'd always do it by hand. It's the kind of lifestyle that would be tough for even the youngest folks to keep up with for that long. And here they were, getting into their middle years, still at it. Their car was pretty much the only thing they gave in to when it came to modern tech, and even that was parked way out on the property, keeping it at what they called a safe distance. If they needed to use it, they'd have to trek through almost a mile of snow just to reach it. This kind of near-obsessive resistance to convenience and attention to details stayed with them the whole time they were at Barra. Before they even settled in, Guy made a list of 10 principles they'd live by. Every morning, he'd post a calendar page for the day with historical events, personal milestones, a daily quote, and whatever else popped into his head. Guy's notebooks and clipboards tracked every little thing that went on in or around the property. Whether it was what they were growing, a bird that flew by, or even a random squirrel, he never left the house without 5 index cards in his left pocket, each one a different color. The red card was for tracking every penny spent that month. The yellow one held the day's chores, though the blue one had their shopping list, the orange covered short-term projects, and the green one was saved for the bigger tasks that had to get done by the season's end. In the book they took inspiration from, the homestead was painted as this cozy getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, where everyone could drop by, hang out with the owners, and soak in the wholesome vibes. But the Watermans weren't really on the same page when it came to this part. They valued their peace and quiet way too much for that kind of open-door policy. When reporters came by for interviews, they were strictly told not to reveal the homestead's location, worried that it'd turn into a tourist attraction, with Guy and Laura becoming, in their own words, the prized specimens. A part of this reclusive nature stemmed from the fact that Guy, while seemed to have moved on with his life, was still reeling from family issues. The same year he divorced Emily and met Laura, his 18-year-old son Bill, who had just graduated high school, severely injured his leg trying to hop onto a freight train. Guy had been training his sons to be top-notch climbers, so he put everything on the line and made Bill go through a bunch of surgeries to save his leg. But after a few years, the leg had to be amputated, and Bill got a prosthetic. Then when Guy married Laura, his relationship with his sons took a major hit. He always felt they never really forgave him for moving on. The first few years at Barra went by just like that. Guy barely saw his family, and even though his other son, Johnny, who was about a year younger than Bill, kept climbing and shattering records every year, Guy still kept his distance. In fact, on their trip to Alaska to climb Mount Hunter, Guy came and went without even stopping by to see Johnny, who was living in Fairbanks at the time. Then almost 2 years after settling in Barra, Bill, who had been struggling with the fallout from losing his leg, sent a short letter to Guy and the rest of the family. It said he was going on a long trip, but he didn't say exactly where. Some rumors suggest he went north to live with the Inuit tribe, but either way, that was the last anyone heard from him. Bill just disappeared. Johnny kept living and climbing in Alaska. In 1978, he shocked the climbing world with the solo ascent of the southeast spur of Mount Hunter, which had never been climbed before. But after that, he somehow got obsessed with tackling the hardest climbs, which was totally different from Guy's idea of climbing. For Johnny, it wasn't so much about the thrill or experience. It was more of a challenge, something to prove. To him, if he made it out alive, then it wasn't really a climb worth calling hard. In 1981, at 28 years of age, Johnny set his sights on the ultimate challenge of a solo winter ascent of Denali's east face. Back then, it was considered one of the toughest climbs, but Johnny seemed pretty unconcerned about the risks involved. And that's when everything went south for him. Johnny didn't survive the climb and never made it back down. When he was last seen, witnesses reported that he was carrying dangerously low gear, which might have made surviving the mountain's brutal conditions impossible. In the end, it was his uncalculated, daredevil approach that led him to give up his life in a way that left his body never to be found. The incident left a deep scar on Guy's personality. In the first 10 years of life at Barra, he had already been through the worst tragedies he'd ever face. His only escape was the wilderness he'd thrown himself into. So he tried to find some peace out there. He picked a quiet spot on the ridge, south of Mount Lafayette summit, built a cairn of stones, and buried an old pair of Johnny's boots beneath it. Every year, on the anniversary of Johnny's disappearance, Guy and Laura would hike up to the cairn and sing laments in Johnny's memory. Mount Lafayette wasn't just any mountain for Guy. It had been special from day one. When he set the record for climbing the 46 highest peaks in New Hampshire with the Sons, Mount Lafayette was the first one they conquered. That trip also marked his first real escape from the corporate grind he hated, which made it even more meaningful. He even went back to Lafayette later with 3 of his sons, and those hikes turned into some of the happiest memories of their lives, before circumstances tore them apart. And now, with Johnny's boots buried there, the mountain became his second home. For 18 years, Guy and Laura poured their hearts into mountaineering and taking care of the trails around Mount Lafayette. Outside of Barra, it was the only place Guy truly felt at home. Apart from their non-stop schedule of living off the grid, Guy and Laura managed to co-author 5 books over the years. Most of their writing revolved around the same themes of clean camping and leaving no trace in the wilderness. Guy was also pretty outspoken against the use of modern technology in mountaineering. In his 4th publication, Backwood Ethics, published in 1993, he went all out, slamming everything from helicopter rescues and loud hiking groups to cell phones and gadgets. His take was pretty straightforward. If you're going to risk climbing a mountain, you should be ready to handle the consequences. Over time, his aversion to modern conveniences only got stronger. What he didn't see coming, though, was the irony. He'd eventually find himself in the exact situation he spent his life rallying against. And worse, it would be entirely by choice. But before all that came what would become the hardest chapter of his life. Guy and Laura's first book came out in 1979, and although it started off strong, catching the attention of hikers and environmentalists, it couldn't go much further than a few thousand copies. That same year, the Appalachian Mountain Club asked them to write a detailed recreational history of the northeastern mountains. The couple thought it would take 3 years to wrap it up, but it ended up dragging on for a decade. When they finally handed it in, AMC told them it was way too long and made them cut out the chapters on technical climbing. That extra work didn't go to waste though. It ended up becoming a separate book later on. But even with that, Guy couldn't shake the feeling that his work wasn't getting the recognition it deserved. Over time, personal losses, his growing frustration with the modern world, and the grind of trying to make it all work only made that feeling worse. In his memoir, he reflected on it all, writing, "A few people have said some very nice things about our books, but on the whole, they and our ideas about eastern wilderness seem to be sinking into oblivion, unnoticed. All this is accompanied by a feeling that I could have done better." On top of everything, the biggest concern bugging them was the realization that they too were somehow becoming part of the problem they'd been fighting against for years. In 1995, they published an article called "Saving the Wilderness, From Whom?" In it, they explained how they'd been holding annual get-togethers in the White Mountains for years, but over time, they started noticing that these reunions, getting bigger and livelier each year, were starting to go against their own beliefs about preserving peace, solitude, and respect for nature, messing with the overall backcountry experience they valued so much. To stay true what they believed in, they made the tough call to stop those gatherings, even though it meant giving up something they really enjoyed. However, that wasn't the end of the story. Around the same time, Laura's knees gave out, and she couldn't hike anymore. Guy, on the other hand, started feeling disconnected from the mountains too. For years, they had completely dominated the New Hampshire peaks. Laura had climbed all 48 1,200-meter peaks at least 7 times, while Guy was practically living on them. He managed to climb each one of them for a total of 16 times, including winter ascents from all 4 directions. But as the 1990s went on, Guy started realizing hiking was turning into more of a technical, gymnastic challenge, not the wilderness experience he once loved. He couldn't help but feel out of place with these newer trends, and if that was the direction things were heading, he hated them too. When people asked what made him feel that way, he'd often joke, "My rock shoes are worn out." His friends didn't take him literally, but they knew he was really pointing to modern trends and how they made him feel like an outsider. Another reason for his gloomy behavior came from a chronic stomach issue that never really got figured out. Some doctors thought it could have been colitis, maybe from drinking that stream water they'd been using forever, or it could have been something totally different. Either way, his doctors were pretty sure it was life-threatening, but Guy, being who he was, refused to undergo any invasive tests. Though he acted like he was strong and that his condition had only made him tougher, his friends could see he was struggling with severe depression, and his mood swings were getting worse. At one point, he even started having episodic bouts. And then came the worst of it yet. On July 3rd, 1998, Guy left Laura at Barra and went for a day of solo hiking in the White Mountains. When he returned that evening, he told her he had climbed to the top of a cliff with the intention of throwing himself off, but had not been able to go through with it. Laura was stunned at first, but then she thought, since he was opening up, maybe he was getting past those thoughts. Sadly, this wasn't the case. Guy started dropping little hints for his friends, telling them in subtle ways that he wouldn't be around for long. He'd mention his memoir, casually saying, "It's all done, except for the last page." Besides that, whenever he wrote notes or letters to his friends, he'd write in the first-person plural tone, speaking for both himself and Laura. But as his mental health took a nosedive, it became just about him, with the letters feeling more like a goodbye, as if he was trying to make sure his friends understood what he had planned. He even went on asking a couple of his friends to bring a cassette recorder to Barra so he could tape himself playing a few of his favorite waltzes. They knew it was for his memorial service. That part, though, is the most haunting of the whole thing. At one point, his friends and Laura knew what he was planning, but none of them could do anything to talk him out of it. They just figured it wouldn't happen anytime soon. But with Guy Waterman, nothing had ever been predictable. That fateful day came crashing way too early. On Sunday, February 6, 2000, Guy got up early, sticking to his usual routine of writing by the glow of a kerosene lamp and waiting for Laura to wake up too. When they finally sat together around 8:30 in the morning, he handed her a few typewritten pages from his memoirs. But when Laura looked at his face, she immediately felt something was off. Perhaps she could sense that it might be the last time she'd ever see him. But after their short exchange, Guy headed out the door, starting his mile-long trek through the snow to where their car was parked. He drove over to the post office, mailed some letters to friends, then hit the road, heading 104 kilometers east to check the latest weather report from the Mount Washington Summit Observatory. After that, he turned back west, heading towards Franconia Notch Mountain Pass. He parked his car on the east side of the highway, right across from a tough rock formation called Canyon Cliff. From there, just about a kilometer or two ahead, was his destination, the mountain he loved most, Mount Lafayette. Standing 1,600 meters tall, over the years, he'd had plenty of highs and lows on his trails, and in that darkest moment of his life, there was nowhere else he wanted to be. With a small pack of food essentials, just enough to get him to the summit, and his father's old, worn-out ice axe in hand, Guy Waterman set off up the trail around noon. His gear was as weathered as he was, but it didn't matter. This was his mountain. A few hundred meters in, he crossed paths with Marty Sample, who would later recall seeing him for the last time, heading upward with quiet determination. Just around sunset, Guy scribbled the final note and the cards tucked into his pocket. 5 p.m. Summit. He then pressed on to reach an exposed ridge of the mountain. There he planted his father's axe in the snow and braced himself against the brutal winds. The freezing gusts felt like the wing of an airplane slicing through the air, relentless and unforgiving. Guy lay down in front of the axe, his mind heavy with years of pain, loss, and a never-ending search for solitude. And in that moment, with the cold seeping deeper into his bones, it all came to an end, slowly, painfully, and quietly, as he succumbed to hypothermia. That night, the Mount Washington Observatory recorded a bone-chilling temperature of minus 16 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds were clocked between 110 to 145 kilometers per hour. We can only wonder what went through his mind in those final moments. Was this something he had really thought through? Or was it just another one of those depressive episodes he always insisted he didn't have? The way he chose to die had a lot of people thinking it wasn't something he planned out perfectly. When he didn't come back after 4 days, Laura called in search and rescue teams. A National Guard helicopter was sent out to look for him, but a nasty storm made the search impossible. That's when his close friends decided to step in. They brought a group of experienced rescuers and search dogs up the mountain, and on February 11th, they finally found his body. But instead of giving everything a closure, it just kicked off a whole new chain of controversies. People were quick to point out that while Guy had spent years criticizing how people treated untouched wilderness, he left his own body out in the open on the mountain, a move that totally went against everything he stood for. Then there was his book, Wilderness Ethics, where he wrote, "One has to be sympathetic with public anger about the enormous costs expended in efforts to save people who often have acted foolishly. That such people should pay the costs of rescue efforts seems to us an unarguable point. If you get yourself in trouble, you get yourself out, or you pay." The irony was, a Black Hawk helicopter was sent to search for him, costing taxpayers around $1,500 an hour to operate. On top of that, the chopper hovered over untouched parts of the mountain range, was exactly the kind of thing Guy was always rallying against. On top of everything, Guy and Laura were all about avoiding the media and really valued their privacy. They didn't want the spotlight, but the way he chose to end things, it left Laura in the middle of a media storm with endless interviews and questions pouring in. For a lot of people, especially the Waterman's close friends, the hardest part was knowing what Laura had to go through without him. Back when her knees gave out and Guy started drifting away from hiking because of it, someone asked him how it felt to stay away from the mountains he loved so much. He responded by saying, "I'd rather have Laura without mountains than mountains without Laura." But in the end, he not only left her behind, but also chose the mountains over the woman he loved. Nearly 200 people showed up for Guy Waterman's memorial service, way more than could fit in the small congregational church of East Corinth. A little cassette player on the altar played a mix of waltzes Guy had recorded himself. His ashes were scattered in bara, and as he'd requested, his shoes were buried under the same cairn where he'd once buried Johnny's. After Guy passed, Laura set up a non-profit fund in his name, focused on keeping the spirits of wildness alive and preserving the alpine regions of northeastern North America. The Waterman Fund does this through education, trail work, and research. Laura really embraced the values Guy lived by, and over time, she became just as passionate about those causes. Maybe even more so.